Dobry Visher, that's as close to saying good evening in Russia that in Russian. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Lieutenant General Krishnan, and it's a privilege to be part of this program. It's taking stock of the Indo-Russian Treaty of 1971 and the friendship between our two countries. We will do this through Mrs. Achala Moulik's book titled Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation of 1971. Let me at the outset congratulate her, Mr. Ravi was just talking. I really read through the book because it really interested me a lot. One has been very closely associated with Russia and the Russian equipment. So that was one reason why I had some very close relations with Russia and visited with Russia about 4 or 5 times. And therefore, a book was of immense interest to me. I must congratulate her for this excellent work on Indo-Russian relations. Congrats to you, Mrs. Asla. Her book commemorates the 50th anniversary of the 1971 treaty. Most of you would have heard, some may be knowing in detail what the treaty actually meant for us as a country, some may not be knowing so intimately. Before I go into the book and discuss with Mrs. Achla, I must say a word about her. Both her parents were diplomats. She graduated from London University. She had a distinguished career in the Indian Administrative Service and was the Education Secretary to Government of India. She was also the Director General of Archaeological Survey of India. Despite her demanding professional career, I find she's authored more book than many full-time authors. 28 books covering a wide spectrum of topics actually, fiction to political and cultural history, architectural heritage, biography, poetry, and even play. But of all this, work on Russia has been her most favorite. And she's also a recipient of the prestigious Pushkin Medal and the Sergei Yeznin, I hope I've got the pronunciation okay, prize, both are Russian prize awards for literary work. Ladies and gentlemen, although the book is titled, the Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation of 1971, and it commemorates the 50th anniversary of signing of the treaty. It covers far more than just the treaty, and in fact, it encapsulates the entire spectrum of the fascinating relationship between our two countries. It's a relationship which is truly unparalleled. In the book, Mrs. Asla actually recounts how the two nations, with almost diametrically opposite political systems, ideologies, and economic structures, have enjoyed a consistent relationship of mutual respect, confidence, and cooperation over 75 years. As highlighted by the publisher, this is what the publisher had to say, and I fully endorse his comments. The book is a seamless amalgam of historical facts, political and cultural ties, and events. And I can say, having gone through the book, the icing on the cake actually are the accounts of her connections at a personal level. That's very, very interesting. You all must read the book. The book gives an unbiased view of events as they unfolded. It traces the fundamental tenets of the Soviet foreign policy, the fluctuating US-Soviet relations, now which is very, very important, considering that everything in international relations, there's a shadow which is cast by the parties' relations with the US, and goes on to the West's reluctance actually to cede space and give recognition to whatever Russia had done at different points in time in the history, Indo-Soviet relations, the 1971 treaty, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and revival of the ties between India and Russia in the post-Cold War multipolar world. The unbiased nature of Achla's works and views and outlook actually is best captured in the words of the then Union HRD minister, I think he was the HRD minister, Mr. Murli Manohar Joshi. While talking to the Russian ambassador then, the minister had said, referring to Achala, that she does not write or speak to please anybody. And having read the book, I can vouch for it. What the minister then said is evident right through the book. Before we proceed further, Achala wanted me to set the context by giving a little backgrounder to the Indo-Russian military ties. Being a military man, having been associated with some of the military, ties that we have with Russia, she wanted me to spend a couple of minutes on that. But considering the time available, I will not go into details, but I will confine myself to giving a very brief overview, flagging certain random points. The most significant milestone was indeed the 1971 war. And ladies and gentlemen, we couldn't have achieved the spectacular military victory of 1971 war without the guarantee of preventing interference from external forces, and to be specific, interference from America and China. Most of you may know, except maybe the younger generations, that how the US 7th Fleet actually physically attempted to stall the critical final phase of our military operation in the then East Pakistan. And one can say without any reservation that, but for the Soviets' show of force, again physically close to our coastal waters, we would have been forced to stop short of a victory. Bangladesh may not have been born. We wouldn't have had a Bangladesh today. There would have been no Pak army surrender with over 90,000 soldiers, which they actually did. The next issue is the dimension of our arms and military equipment inventory. We have a huge inventory of military equipment, Russian equipment. Our entire tank fleet, starting from the old T-55 tanks to the T-72 and T-90 tanks, which are still in service and doing a great job, unlike what the lot of Western media wants us to believe, saying that the Russian equipment is no good in Ukraine. Please don't believe them. We have, operated them, and maybe you are as good as Russians in operating some of these Russian equipment. They are really good. We have our infantry combat vehicles, BMP fleet, entirely it is Russian equipment. We have the whole spectrum of missiles which are Russian. We have submarines which are Russian, aircraft carrier which is a Russian origin, destroyers, frigate, air defense system. I don't want to go into it. Air defense system is a complex system, which starts from a very long range to middle range, short range, shoulder fired, and the whole thing is integrated onto an electronic platform, radar controlled. So nobody parts with the best of equipment. So all these we have our entire the Air Force fleet, starting from the good old MiG 21s to Sukhoi 7s and the current Sukhoi 30s. We have a lot of Russian equipment. We have Russian transport aircrafts, our IL-76, IL-78, our helicopter fleets also are by and large Russian. The world-class BrahMos missile which we have today, it's the best in its class in the world. The cruise missiles, supersonic cruise missiles, it's a joint Indo-Soviet project. Our nuclear-powered submarine, nobody parts with these technologies. We had used on two spells of 10 years each, nuclear submarines leased from Russia to have our people trained, and they are all well trained now. And we have a ongoing project of building one of our own with a very high degree of cooperation assistance from Russians. A natural question that would strike anyone is, how have we come to this and why is it so? It doesn't sound very safe, and you don't feel very comfortable with the kind of list that I have just listed out. Nobody would. So that's a natural question that would come to anybody's mind. So why has it come? Why have we come to such a stage? Weapons and equipment procurement are not a simple one-time purchase. Yeah, all these major platforms like tanks, ships, aircraft carriers, and all, they remain in service for 30, 40, some even 50 years. So now to keep them battle worthy for such a long span of time is a huge challenge. And it needs a great deal of support from the original equipment manufacturers. At some point in time, our inventory had almost 70% of Russian equipment. Today, it's down to about 50 to 60% because we are also live to this, and there is a deliberate attempt to diversify. Achieving self sufficiency in war machinery is a very long process. If you decide today, it may take about 25, 30, 35 years for you to achieve a diversification of any meaningful degree. And even diversification is a very of source of equipment is a long drawn out process. Now, Russia didn't force their equipment on us. We must be very, very clear about that. Nor did they trick us into buying their equipment. Uh, it's a reflection of our necessity as it existed over the years. It's not our fault too. It's out of the necessity, and there was nothing wrong with it. There is nothing bad with it. It's also very important to know that countries do not give top of the shelf equipment, whether it's American, German, or anybody. Nobody gives top of the shelf equipment to you. We must admit, and also they give you equipment with a lot of conditions attached to it. And if you don't follow those conditions, somebody will just hold back some of the critical supply. It's like the auto, the what we are seeing in the auto industry today. You may have the car, but you may not have the semiconductors to run it. Just that small little 4-5 chips. So that's the kind of control countries manage to exert when they sell military equipment. And I must make it very clear that most of the Russian equipment that came to us were of the latest technology of the time, whenever we got it. And also, they all came on comparatively liberal. Nobody else would have given us at such liberal terms and conditions. So, as far as military ties are concerned, Russia is a time tested, reliable defense partner. Having said that, if you ask me, do we need to diversify? The answer is yes. Are we doing it? The answer is again yes. But it takes time, like I said, and also needs to be done maintaining a balance and without actually diluting good relations with Russia. We are going about it in a very well planned manner, and our Make in India programs are also making good headway. With that as the backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, let's go into an interactive session with Mrs. Achala. I shall be bringing out some of the aspects which are covered in her book. And as we go along, request her to elaborate on certain facts, interesting stories. She has many of them, background information, and personal experience. In fact, her personal experience are unending, which some of it she has very eloquently covered in her book. But before we start the interactive session, Mrs. Achla, would you like to tell us something? Anything? Say what prompted you to write on the topic, or your emotional connect with Russia.
I'm very glad to see. Very glad to see young people here, because at a time when I and my generation were growing up, we lived at a time of the Cold War, and the world was divided in two, and India stood very proudly as a neutral nation. Strangely enough, I've said this story before, my interest in Russia started when I was 7 years old. We were on our way to America. My father had just been posted there to Washington. And what prompted my parents to give me to read Rabindranath Tagore's famous Letters from Russia. It was in very chaste Bengali. I didn't speak a word of English, but I knew good Bengali. So I sat in the plane trying to understand what this country was about. And since nobody bothered to explain in those days, we didn't take our children the way we have to pay homage to them now. We were left to our own devices. So I was reading and I assumed that this land of snow and forest was where we were going. So when we landed in New York, I asked my mother, where are the forests, where's the snow? And she asked me why, and she said, I said, you gave me to read letters from Russia. She said, no, but this is America. Then I asked, then why did you give me this book to read? So dismissive. So I was fascinated from that age. And Gurudev has written in such beautiful, eloquent Bengali, and then, of course, this was in English also, later, that this land, which he starts by saying that in a decade, they have swept away the injustices and cruelties of a millennium. And this in Bengali sounds even much better. So I thought, what kind of cruelty, what kind of injustices was there? Because we hadn't seen it in India. Of course, I was a very small girl when they barely remember the horrors of partition in Calcutta. And that set me thinking. And so as I went along, and the one thing I'd like to say, I may speak in that way, but I'm not anti-Western. My happiest years of my life were in college and school in the West. The people are wonderful, any of them you go, their warmth, their kindness, generosity. So it's a very strange kind of division they have. And so I started reading about Russia. And 1957 was the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. And we were amazed. I was a teenager and they came, my father was in London. They had grand celebrations of the Russian culture, the Bolshoi Ballet, everybody. And Londoners just soaked it in. There were just queues and queues. There was this fascination for Russia. And but our relation with Russia is actually much older. And I was discussing with General that those who have done proto-history know that many people may not know that our languages, linguistic affinities, the old Vedic religion and the old Slavonic religion have so much in common. And there was a linguistic expert in Russia, Malinovsky, who found there were about 1,000 words common between Old Slavonic and Sanskrit. And then, of course, it was a huge swathe of land from Iranian plateau right up to the gates of China. So, but that has been forgotten, that proto-history. And the West has more or less tried to, wipe out all this. And then our contact with Russia began, apart from proto-history, was when a very interesting man came in 1498 to visit India. He was a famous traveler called Afnasi Nikitin. And this is where the difference between the West and Russia appears. He wrote a wonderful travelogue called Travels Beyond the Seven Seas. And he describes India with great respect, admiration about he talks of the personal morality of the people, their kindness, how devoted they are to their religion. There is not a hint of condescension. There is not even one iota of, that they're looking around for bases or for commerce, which by the time Europe came, they were already planning conquest and commerce in the coast of Kerala, in Goa, and parts of coastal Bengal. So that, of course, was 400 years later. But the real thing which struck me when I was reading about Russia was, while my husband wrote a book on the Orientalists, the East India Company scholars, of which the most famous was Sir William Jones, who really made India known to the West. And he was a great scholar, and he got so many people with him. And Charles Wilkins was an East India Company scholar who translated the Bhagavad Gita in English. And imagine East India Company board of directors commissioned this work while they were annexing territory after territory. But before Sir William Jones, while I was editing my husband's book, I saw that the Russians had started Indology earlier. And Peter the Great, after he defeated the Swedish army, which was the most powerful army in the world at that time, he defeated them because they wanted to, as they're doing now, encroaching on Russian territory. And then after the battles were over and he learned shipbuilding from England, how to organize a navy from Holland, he decided he must look eastward, something which is not mentioned very often. And he sent scholars to India, to China, and they collected manuscripts. And he built a house called the King's House, in which he housed all these manuscripts. And that's when the interest of Russians began in India. And it had no colonial agenda, no commerce. It was just a pure intellectual interest for a country which fascinated them. So our relations with Russia began then. And of course, I've been writing about the Russian Revolution and about the lives of Russian writers. But this book came about when one day I was just recovering from COVID, and I found a couple of letters from my sister, who was then going to go in the middle of the Indo-Pak War. She wrote, I don't know how we'll travel, because my mother had fallen ill and she was going to Rome. And then, little anecdotes about what was happening in Calcutta. It was bursting at the seams. About 3-4 million East Bengal refugees had come, Hindus and Muslims. And it was nightmarish, because Bengal had already lived through the trauma of partition. And the people from East Bengal, the Hindus, never really settled down. So then I thought, just 1 year away will be the Indo-Pak War and the famous treaty. So that's what prompted me to write it.
On the lighter vein, I must say that I wish there were some Russians also here. They would have felt a little better. We have so many good things to talk about them. So let's get on with it. With that as the backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, I'll try and take you through the book, seeking Mrs. Achala's intervention as we go along. The book actually commemorates 50 years of the Golden Jubilee of the Indo-Soviet Peace, Friendship and Cooperation Treaty of 71. You recounted events covering up the run-up to the treaty, how critical the treaty was for India, and major features of the treaty. Can you tell us in what form does the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 71 exist today?
Well, when the Soviet Union was dismantled, Yeltsin was under pressure from Clinton and even some pressure from China to alter some of the clauses in which Russia was to come to the aid of India in case of aggression from other countries. So that Yeltsin tried to, and I think he succeeded in modifying that crucial clause.
Okay.
So, but the other terms and clauses of cooperation still exist.
Okay. Probably, I think there is logic to that. At that particular point in time, we really needed it. And as I explained, that was the singular factor which helped us, realize our potential during the war. You actually very lucidly covered in your opening session, as to how the cultures between the Soviet Union and India began in prehistoric times, and the connection between Sanskrit and the old Slavic. And also, you've given us a lot of examples starting from 1700s. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about the old linkages? Or?
Well, another which I forgot to mention, apart from the Indologists under the Peter the Great's time, there's a very interesting thing. Bengal is known for its modern drama and theatre. Now, we had in old Bengal, pre-colonial Bengal, there was the jatras, we say in Bengal, which were like the kabuki, sort of dance and drama. And then a man, very fascinating man, came to Bengal at the same time as William Jones, and he brought modern drama and play to Bengal. And the Calcutta theatre began under him, a man called Gerasim Lebedev. I think the Cold War started then, because the British, when they saw that Lebedev was so popular, it set up this theatre, and all the aristocracy, Dwarakanath Tagore, who was the grandfather of Rabindranath, he used to visit there and pay there. Then the East India Company said, "We must put an end to this." So they burnt down the theatre. And then again, the rich Bengali merchants built it. So it's been going on like this for quite some time. And when the revolution, this I think I mentioned about the mutiny.
Okay, yeah, let me just, okay,
Yeah.
when coming to the mutiny, actually you brought out that, in 1857, the Russia was the only European country that supported, let me call it, India's struggle for independence. You also posed a question if any of today's democracies have actually helped countries attain independence from their colonial rulers. That question I think is very relevant, which you posed in your book. And coming to the World War II, you have mentioned that Russia played a very positive role during the war. But the West, as always, has been very hesitant to recognize the positive role played by Russia during World War II.
It was at that moment, and President Roosevelt said, I mean, he's believed to have said, but his Avril Harriman somewhere mentions, that when he heard of the battle, the defeat of Stalingrad and the surrender of General von Paulus, he said, "I can sleep in peace tonight. The war is won."
Let me pick up from there. You dwelt upon Nikita Khrushchev's message about Soviet Union's commitment to peaceful coexistence and the Soviet efforts to modify Stalin's hostile anti-West policy actually post-World War II. And subsequently coming to the post-Soviet collapse, you also elaborated Russia's overtures to the US and the West, which actually could have augured extremely well for the rest of the world. But again were ignored by them. So primarily you are implying that the Soviet efforts and later Russian overtures for fostering peace and cooperation were never masked and deliberately ignored by the West.
Yes, this is borne out, and this you don't get documents on this, but from what I've spoken to my Russian friends in the Foreign Service, in the academia, they have all said this, that we didn't want war, we didn't want Cold War. Second World War was bad enough to rebuild Russia. I mean, here's a distinguished lady sitting there whose husband was ambassador in Russia, and he used to tell me, Mr. Peter Senai, that the suffering they underwent and the way they built up Soviet Union is, an epic story. And I wish he was here today, Roina. And they wanted peace with the West. They realized, and one of the reasons, not the main reason, one of the reasons Russia was weakened was the Afghanistan episode, in which the West, UK and USA played an absolutely Machiavellian role. Today, the Islamic fundamentalism we can lay at the door of America. They created the Mujahideen. They armed them just so that the Soviets would be evicted. So with all that background, Russia thinking that the communist system had ended and they wanted to join the mainstream with the West. They felt they were Europeans.
I think, coming to a little lighter note, you note in your book that you observed actually that Soviet Union did not appreciate Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit being appointed as India's first ambassador to Soviet Union. Why was it so?
I think there, Panditji, Jawaharlal Nehru was otherwise a very learned, enlightened man, and who was very good with human beings in personal. He had this dynastic tendency, and there were so many seasoned diplomats there from the old ICS who could have been there. Later on, the person who went there did much to build ties with Russia, and that was KPS Menon. But he thought his sister must get a good posting and sent, of all the things, when she came later to Washington, my parents were there and she was a great success, even in England. But Russia was a disaster. And the story was told to my father by the man who followed her, our great President Radhakrishnan. And strangely enough, this story of Arthur Koestler, Yoga and the Commissar. Strangely enough, this very devout Hindu metaphysical philosopher, Dr. Radhakrishnan, and this atheist communist, Stalin, they got along famously. They used to have private dinners and talk till midnight. And then one day, I believe Dr. Radhakrishnan told my father, finally I asked him, with great respect, why didn't you appreciate this very beautiful, charming? He said it was a slight, Stalin said, it was a slight that a lady, however elegant and refined, with no background in diplomacy, no background in governance, should be sent to the Soviet Union. And we all felt that Nehru was not showing adequate respect to us. So she was never allowed to present her credentials.
That's very interesting. Going ahead, you say that the Marshall Plan for economic recovery of Western Europe after World War II actually discriminated against countries outside Europe. Is such discrimination prevalent even today, when one comes across the treatment of refugees based on their racial background and also the inadequate assistance that is being provided to countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and even Sri Lanka?
Totally. Because I think they wanted Europe, the American government, the Americans, they wanted Europe as a buffer between Soviet Union and themselves, though a huge ocean separated them. But Russia was Europe, and they wanted these people as their, what Mr. Putin called Germany and France the other day, the vassal states of USA. So Europe had to be rebuilt and restructured, and the danger also was that by 1948, Greece, Italy, Spain, even Portugal under Salazar, they were being attracted to communism because their societies were so unequal between the rich and the poor. The communist parties in these countries were making headway. So to preempt that, America began pouring aid to all these countries, mainly in Southern and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe mainly. So they lavished there, and the whole Europe was, in 10 years, they were again back to better standard than pre-war. But they have not shown that at all, and there was a small video, they showed a small film of Afghanistan. It was so pathetic that because they've frozen their assets abroad, they are on the verge of collapse, they are on collapse, and there's such a shortage of food. I mean, it is unbelievable. We have not seen this in India. Children foraging in dustbins to pick up discarded bread, which are encrusted with fungus. And they are dying eating that kind of bread. And the Taliban head of I forget his name, he said, please don't punish our people because we are not giving women's education. Imagine making a whole country suffer because women are not going to school. I mean, that's their problem. I'm sure they'll sort it out. And the Ukrainian refugees came, all the Afghans and all the Syrians, all asked to go back. Literally driven out. So this is racialism.
Okay, and maybe, outsourcing some of these people, the migrants, to faraway places like Rwanda by UK is maybe another example of that. Ladies and gentlemen, one aspect that Mrs. Achala repeatedly brings out in her book is that the Soviet Union, or later on even Russia, never objected to neutral stance by India, even on issues where they had stakes. And she quotes as an example the Korean War. She has further compared the Soviet reaction to the Bandung Conference with that of how the US and the West reacted. She traces events even further down the years to indicate a consistency in this not so helpful approach towards India by the West and the US in in contrast to the consistent support that we've received from the Soviet Union and Russia by recalling the West's proposal for a UN peacekeeping force in JNK. They actually wanted a UN peacekeeping force to be set in JNK, which was actually it did not happen because the then Soviet Union boycotted it, vetoed it. Subsequently, even their condemnation of India's claim to Goa was quite alarming, and the only country, only one of the only major country which sided with us was Soviet Union then. After touching upon these examples, you've actually observed that despite following different economic and political systems, India and Russia have maintained a very close cooperation and excellent bilateral relations over 7 decades. The 71 Treaty being the most striking milestone. You pointed out that in contrast to this, despite being democracies, US aid always comes accompanied by strings and obligations curtailing to the recipient's sovereignty. Would you like to elaborate this a little?
Well, now the situation is slightly different because India has become an economic power. But one stark example was in 1953 when India was having huge food shortages. And at that time, my father was in USA in the embassy there. And Jawaharlal Nehru literally begged President Truman, who had received him very warmly when he came for the first visit in 49, Eisenhower, saying that we need food. And the American response was, you have to declare yourself as part of the free world, which Nehru refused to do. And this was extraordinary. I mean, here is a country it was near famine condition in India, but they wouldn't. Then they said, you have to endorse the San Francisco Peace Treaty between US and Japan, which it was not a peace treaty, it was actually Japan in subjugation, bases in Japan, and the Japanese resented it because when father went there, posting there, he found enormous resentment against the Americans, which they, being a very reserved people, which they kept under control. So at every stage when there was any international thing in which India enjoyed a huge moral status, though we were very poor, there was a condition attached. In Korean War, there was enormous pressure on Nehru to side with America, to say this is the free world and China that tried. And Nehru said, I don't want to get, very wisely, he said, I don't want any trouble with China. It's a fellow Asian country which has suffered with us. And they said, let's let them sort it out. So every time they wanted even help, it had to be. And even now, I think Russia wanted to give us certain equipment. I forget the name of that.
S-400.
No, the cryogenic.
Cryogenic engines.
Yes. They were about to give it, and Clinton said nothing doing. That cannot be given. Whereas Russia is willing to help us with their very high-tech equipment. So there has been a string attached to any help, and to every country. I mean, the CENTO Pact, the Baghdad Pact, the CETO, it was not just given, we will give you arms, we will protect you from communism, and most of them are feudal monarchies in West Asia, similar things in Southeast Asia. So there was always a condition attached, quid pro quo, which you may think is reasonable. And I feel very proud that India resisted all these pressures.
While at it, I must tell you, there are a lot of unseen dimensions of military equipment and assistance. There is a book, Duty, by one of the old former US Defense Secretaries, Gates, I think, Robert Gates. He narrates in that, I think it was, if my memory serves me right, it was F-16s supplied to Israel, and when he had visited Saudi Arabia, they told him the other way around. They were giving it to the Saudis, so when he went to Israel, They told him that the only country against whom they're going to use these are Israel. So why have you given it to them? So he said, "Don't worry, we've given them the aircrafts. It's up to us to see that, when it doesn't suit the world or when it doesn't suit us, it will not take off." So that just shows, you may get the best of defense equipment, but some of these countries make sure that it may not remain. You may not be able to take off all these top of the shelf equipment like a fighter aircraft and all. They're so highly technical. There will be some part or the other which may have to be changed after every sortie. It may be a small little part. A sortie is one takeoff and one landing. It may be a very small part, but if you don't have it, you don't have it. The aircraft will not take off for the next sortie. So that just shows they may part with equipment, but they retain the control with them. So that is so in that way, the Soviet Union has been generous to us. I can say this from personal experience. Now, you've quoted Brezhnev's statement in 1973 about Indo-Soviet friendship, which is very revealing. Would you like to say something about that, or?
Yeah, well, the Indo-Pak War was over, and Brezhnev had come to India, and there was this huge gathering in Vigyan Bhavan. And he spoke with great respect about India and how two great nations have come together, and said that Russia has no colonial past, never had any colonies in Asia or Africa, and they had so much in common, and that he had great respect for India and hope for partnership, and he hoped that India will play a very leading role in building up that the Soviet Union was still very powerful then, that India will maintain her neutrality and that the stability of India will bring peace to the region. So this was remarkable, and Mrs. Gandhi was absolutely astonished that he endorsed India's neutrality and her role as a stabilizing factor in Southeast Asia. Even in 65 war, many people have said that Russia played a devious game. They said Tashkentian diplomacy. But later, Mr. Gromyko told in the Indian press that we don't want, only the enemies of India and Pakistan want them to go to war. Because if there is peace between India and Pakistan, many of the problems and turmoil of this region will be solved.
Back to the US again. I think like Russia, US also seems to be on your favorite list. You stated that in the US, it is the people who have upheld the country's lofty ideals and not so much the government. One wonders, while I was reading, I was actually wondering if that's true of most democracies. And coming on to something else that you brought out in your book, you observed that the lack of experience of Rajiv Gandhi was found reflected in his policies and utterances in the Indo-Russian context. Would you like to elaborate that?
Yes, Rajiv Gandhi decided that he was going to depart from his mother's stand. Now, how he, with no respect to the dead, but how he could think that he could rival his mother and outshine his mother, itself is a mystery. And so he went and he had these boon companions, the Doon school boys, who told him that we must be westward ho and everything. So they decided that they were going to weaken their ties, gradually distance themselves from Soviet Union. And he went to America a year after becoming Prime Minister, where he was welcome. But seeing the video of that, it's very strange when President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan welcome Mrs. Gandhi with great, praise and warmth and respect. They didn't show and she maintained a very stiff And when Reagan spoke that, Madam Prime Minister, you have so much influence with the Soviet Union, tell them to end the occupation of Afghanistan. She just quietly turned her face away. That's all, nothing else. But when Rajiv Gandhi went in 85, somehow their attitude was very lukewarm. The same president probably realized it's not quite up to the mark. And after coming to India, he had a press conference. And this was told to my husband by one of his batchmates who was in the PMO. And he called the leading press barons and said, no more favorable articles on Soviet Union. And this astonished the entire establishment. That how he could, suddenly then, of course, your defense people came and told him that this is absolutely suicidal. Don't behave like this. Now, this is something not known, but and then, of course, as he ran into trouble, and when Soviet Union was falling apart economically in 1989, Gorbachev came to India and gave us a huge loan. So this is how Rajiv Gandhi tried to, he probably wanted to change the course of history.
No, at that stage, amidst the huge impact that collapse of Soviet Union made on the global geopolitics, how did India cope with it?
I read a beautiful article which I have quoted in my book. Two husband and wife team came. They were journalists from the Christian Monitor. And they said India, very nice article showing what was the relationship of India and Russia, and said, India seems to be in mourning, as if they have lost a beloved friend. And I think there was a lot of apprehension about the future of our country when this happened, because whether we like it or not, Soviet Union was a great support in the Bangladesh war, in building up our industries, the pharmaceuticals, the steel mills, Indian Institute of Technologies, and a lot of medicines in this whole era of 60s and 70s. Apart from the defense, there were so many other aids. So I think India felt quite lost. And they realized they had to go elsewhere and went looking for changes. But I think there was a feeling sort of divided. Many in India welcomed this, and others felt that this was a loss and a diminishing of their own status. Because having Soviet Union as a friend, if not as an ally, certainly fortified our position, which was not there after 1992.
And ladies and gentlemen, if I may just add, we must give it to the Russians that at least all the defense contracts that we had signed with the erstwhile Soviet Union, they honored most of it. Everything that could be honored, they did. They did run into a lot of problems because after the Soviet Union collapsed, like you take an aircraft or a tank. If it was a tank, a radiator of a tank is not like that of a vehicle. It's very, very complex. It's quite difficult to make. An engine came from probably Ukraine. The radiator came from somewhere else, maybe Turkmenistan or somewhere. So they had a lot of problem in taking on the responsibility. Russia faced a lot of problem in taking on the responsibility of honoring those commitments. But to their credit, they did honor some of it. There were some cost overruns, there were some time overruns, there were some problems, but they did it without causing any major problems to us. Now, you've written a lot about a person called Alexander Kadakin, who was the Russian ambassador here, and someone you seem to hold in very high esteem and enjoyed excellent rapport with. Tell us something about his contribution to the Indo-Russian relations.
I have narrated in the book, he came as a probationer diplomat to India. He had specialized in Indian languages, Indian history, and he said it was so symbolic that he arrived in Delhi the day the Treaty of Friendship was being signed on 9th August 1971. And he said, but I was very distressed that nobody was at the airport to help me go to the Russian embassy. So he said, that was my first venture in speaking in Hindi to a taxi man in, that was then the Palam airport. And he landed up in the embassy. They gave him short shrift. And he became very fluent in Hindi, Urdu. He spoke other languages also. So he was here and for many years, and he was the private secretary to the then ambassador, Mr. Malsev, who was a very tough Soviet type. And I had met him in 1976 when I had just published my first book on the history of Russian literature. And the great Drs. Svetoslav Rorik and Devi Karani, they had invited me to meet him and said, you get Mr. Kadarkin to help you go to Russia on some Soviet trip and see if you can get the translation done in Russian. And here two very headstrong people met, and he said, yes, we will do everything for your book, but you must remove the chapter on Solzhenitsyn. And I said, why? He said, no, he's anti-patriotic. I said, well, he's the greatest Russian living writer. He said, then you can't go to Russia. I said, I don't want to go to Russia. And then we argued about, Soviet literature and everything. It was not a very friendly meeting. Then, many years later, when Soviet Union had collapsed, he came as the ambassador. And I thought, this is my chance of being a little nasty. And I sent him the book again, saying, I don't know whether you remember meeting me. And we discussed this book. Of course, I never got around to visiting Russia on a scholarship or whatever. And I've quoted that letter, which was sent to me by the person who took charge after his death, and which, such modesty, I would have ignored a cheeky letter like that. But he wrote, yes, you were right, with a sort of, sad resignation that you were right. Solzhenitsyn and all those people whom you have praised have been vindicated. And the last line was very moving. Please go on writing about my sad country. And then, of course, we used to meet very often. And he, when I was going to Moscow for the Pushkin Award, which normally was given at the Russian embassy, but he said, you go to Moscow. And then he phoned up and he said, you have to speak in Russian. So I told him my Russian is very rusted. I won't be able to manage. He said, no, you can't disgrace me. Mr. Putin will be there. Mr. President Medvedev will be there. You have to speak in Russian. So then I was to leave on the 2nd November, and he summoned me to the embassy and said, now speak. So I read out the speech. He said, yes, I think you will pass. So he was absolutely devoted to India. There was nothing about India which he didn't know, whether it's our religion, our custom, our music. And very symbolic that, he passed away on Republic Day. And he used to say that when he was posted in Sweden, in Stockholm, he told many of his colleagues and told me later, I used to dream of India, that I must go there, that something draws me there. And he came here for his second tenure. And he was a real Indologist.
That's indeed very interesting to hear about somebody like that. He died in India.
On Republic Day.
Yeah, on Republic Day. I mean, that's a great tribute to the person that he was from your account. Now, something which strikes is every action that against Russia by the US, Europe or NATO actually pushes Russia closer to China. That makes India-Russia ties very complex, considering China's belligerent stance on the LAC. It isn't that other countries do not face such dilemma. For example, one can think of the contradictions faced by Australia, Japan and New Zealand in balancing the what is called the RCEP, the Comprehensive Regional Economic Program with Quad. Now, how should India proceed?
Well, I think President Trump, much maligned that he was, I think he realized this very essential thing that if China has to be, I mean, not suppressed, but has to be slightly made less powerful, and that would be for America and Russia to have friendship. And he did go towards that. He was trying to do that. And now the Ukraine war has pushed China, pushed America, Russia close to China. They're supporting Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think only time will say, and it's very difficult, option for us. Considering all the pressures and the pulls in different directions, personally, I think we are doing a good job.
And if I may just intervene, in the past, when Russia has been having, in fact, the Treaty of Friendship was signed at a time when Russia was facing enormous problems with China on the Ussuri River, the borders. And 1959, we are told that Khrushchev rang up Zhou Enlai and said, don't do this in Tibet. He told them, don't do this. Their main thing was to have a huge bloc, Russia, China, India, all these non-aligned countries forming a bloc as a kind of balancing act against the West. So even in 1962, after the Chinese attack, they were quietly sending us arms. But now I think it's come to a point where maybe that will not be. I don't know if it's possible.
Yes, it's a difficult or tightrope walking for us. One of the shortcomings that you've identified in the Indo-Russian relations is that neither side has actually attempted to search for new areas and avenues for collaboration. Considering the geopolitical developments in the backdrop of the Ukraine crisis that you just elaborated, do you see things, how do you see this changing, and how do you see the India-Russia relations in the days ahead?
Well, when I was writing this book, the Ukraine war hadn't started. Now things look a little grim because Mr. Kadakin wrote a long article soon after he came here that, we don't want only the defense alliance. We don't want only technical. People of India, and he promoted the idea, many more Indians should visit Russia. More Russians visit India than Indians visit Russia. And that there should be more commercial ties, that many more Indian companies should open their offices there. It was possible before the Ukraine war. It was proceeding, but now I'm not sure.
Okay. I think a lot of you may have visited Russia, but for those who haven't, I must tell you, St. Petersburg is as pretty as any of the Western cities that we hear of. And if possible, try and visit during one of the closer to the white night, that sometime in May, when there is very little or no night at all. They call it the white night period, when the entire population and the whole lot of tourists are out, especially from maybe 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Language may be a bit of a problem. Unlike the rest of the Europe, you may not be able to get through speaking English. But it's a beautiful tourist destination, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all. Thank you very much for being part of this. And